Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Azaii Muniz.
Oh no! I'm afraid. This is our fear episode of the podcast. It's a special Halloween episode where we're going to be talking about fear. We just thought like, hey, let's try to stay on theme, on brand with what's going on in the world. Actually, I don't know the answer to this, but do you have a Halloween costume this year? Are you doing anything Halloween-y?
So I actually never celebrated Halloween up until a few years ago, where my friends in med school, they were like, dress up, and I dressed up as a mermaid. But I haven't thought about it this year, if I would like dress up or what I would do. Yeah, I take it you must have a very nerdy costume.
Yeah, my significant other and I are doing, we're dressing up as Bunsen and and Beaker from the Muppets, and so I'm super excited about that. But when I was in med school, I did a lot of. So there's two things I love: science and puns, and so I would do a lot of like pun-based science things in med school. I remember one year I was Billy Rubin, and so I dressed up like a hillbilly, and so I had like a name tag said Billy Rubin on it, and then one year I dressed up. Okay, this is a deep cut. So in the fetal heart, like the development of the heart, like it doesn't start off as full heart. At one point, it's the bulbous cordis. And so one year I dressed up as a lesion on the bulbous cordis.
You did not.
And so I was a Bulbasaur.
I love that so much
for Halloween. And like that still is kind of one of my favorite costumes, even though like I was really just like a weird like lumpy tube with like a red spot on it. But like I just remember being, I'm gonna be a Bulbasaur. Like that'll be so great.
That's fantastic. Oh man.
Yeah. No. Anybody feel free to steal that idea. So we're going to be talking about fear today, not costumes, because like fear is a really interesting idea. It's very powerful. We're going to talk about this, but like fear, like there's some research that it implies that fear might be one of the most powerful emotions in terms of getting people to do stuff and motivation and things like that. I'm not a fan of fear. I know that there are some people out there that are kind of like into watching scary movies and stuff. And I'm like, no, like I want to watch happy, fun movies, or movies that make you think, but not ones that make me afraid.
Yeah.
But we're going to talk about all of that. And I'm excited to dive into fear as a topic rather than just experiencing fear.
Yeah. The amount of people that I know that go to like a haunted house kind of things this time of year, I'm just like, I could not. I have this very stark memory of like going, it wasn't even to a haunted house. It was just like an area that had like people out and about. And like, I was young. And somebody, obviously like a character who had been, hired by the area, like came out in like this costume and like with the chainsaw. Obviously the chainsaw was not on, but yeah. I just ran. I'm not a runner, but I became a runner for that. So fear and we don't get along either. But fear is one of the basic emotions. The great thing is that we have other basic emotions besides fear. So we have anger, which I think people can understand that that's like one of the basic emotions. Same with surprise, right? That doesn't necessarily have to correlate with fear. So sometimes you're just like, oh, this is like a great surprise, right? So surprise in general is distinct from fear, although you can have them both together, like haunted houses. Also just disgust. I think that's also for people who are like me, and if they're not smiling and their face is just resting and doing its thing, it's really easy to just look like ew, like
resting disgust face.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have that face. I realized that during our early podcast episodes where I was like, why do I look so angry? Or like, why do I look like I'm just want to get out of here. Like, no, I'm enjoying it. We also have, right, fear, but also sadness. And on the flip side of that, happiness and that kind of joy component. So we talked about this earlier because we both really enjoy just like different ways of remembering things. We talked about this in a prior episode when we talked about
mnemonics.
Yes,
right?
exactly. So you can actually remember the universal emotions with your keyboard. So the next time that you're in front of a keyboard, look down and the middle row, starting with the letter A. So A is anger. S now could be sadness or surprise, but you got to remember that it's going to be surprise here. Okay. Because there's not another name for surprise. So we have anger, surprise. Then we've got disgust, right? Ugh. We have fear. The next one is a little tricky, right? We said we have another name for sadness, and that's gloom. So you're just feeling kind of gloomy, sad, down, and happiness. And so that's probably my favorite way to remember them, because otherwise I have no frame of reference. So at least even if I have to remember, okay, wait, SG, then I have something as a frame of reference.
Yeah. Yeah. And you have your keyboard on test day.
Yes.
So you can like look down and be like, what were the emotions? Oh yeah. Well, look at the keyboard. That'll remind me. I like those kind of like little hack stuff. We should take a moment and just kind of like, what is a universal emotion? What do we mean by that? Like these basic universal emotions. So these are emotions that exist across the humanity, and the way we express them is all the same, right? And so if you met somebody like someone who'd never seen modern society, like some tribe in the Amazon, and you met them, and if they were happy, they would express happiness the same way you would. And all of these other ones, like disgust and fear and anger and surprise. And so that's what we mean by universal emotions, that these are just kind of universal across humanity. We all experience these emotions, and we all show them in the same way. Note that there are some emotions that you might not express the same way, or you might express in different populations, and you might express them differently. Like shame, right? Like shame, like some people might just not be ashamed of anything, right? Like that's just with the way that they, kind of like grew up. And so you do want to know these basic emotions, but we're going to talk specifically about fear, because fear is interesting. Fear is, so I know I kind of like mentioned this, but fear exists. Fear is one of those things we can study, and we want to study, right? I mean, we want to study everything if you're like me, because you just want to learn everything. But fear is something we can study in animals really well. And so we'll study this in animals, we'll study it in people. And so it's pretty well understood. It's hard for us to study like language, right? Developing language, because there's not other animals that develop language at the same level we do, right? But fear, animals experience fear, right? Like rats and squirrels and rabbits and deer and things like that. And so we might want to study these things and measure them. We can kind of measure these in a couple of different ways. If we're looking at humans, you can measure like just the physiologic response, right? Like that fight or flight thing that kind of kicks in. And you can measure this by measuring like the conductivity of skin. I know that seems weird, but when your fight or flight system kicks in, your body thinks, oh, we're going to be running and kicking and punching. And so it sends more blood to your arms and legs. And very often you're going to be overheating when you're like running and sprinting. And so your body will start to sweat. And so you can measure like the conductivity of the skin, because you're sending more blood to that region, and you also end up like in theory sweating more. And so you can just straight up measure this. You could also measure like dilation of pupils and just like a bunch of different things physiologically, right? Measuring what's going on physically to someone's body. You can say like, oh, this person is more afraid than that person, or this person's more afraid than they were a moment ago, by measuring these things and watching these things change. But you could also measure them neurologically. And so you can measure these things via, I think probably the best way is an fMRI, or a functional MRI, where you can go and see what areas of the brain are more active and what areas are less active. We'll talk more about the neuroanatomy of fear here in a second. But basically everything I've kind of talked about here with like measuring fear or looking at fear in animals, like these are things that will show up on test day. These are things that you can see in passages. The MCAT will expect you to know what an fMRI is and how that's different than a regular MRI. Note that a regular MRI just gives you structure, like the shape of the brain. An fMRI, a functional one, tells you what areas of the brain are active. So it's telling you something about activity rather than just structure. A regular MRI could tell you if you have like, a weird, like one of your lobes is misshapen in your brain, but your fMRI could tell you if that lobe is active or not and like what's going on in this. So you want to make sure that you have those kind of terminology down because the MCAT will expect you to know that.
Absolutely. This is also something that if you ever find yourself struggling to remember, there are some interesting ways that I want to have us think about this. So like you said, Phil, fear is one of those things that's truly universal, and we also see it in animals. For whatever reason, the turkeys here in Boston seem to have no fear. So I'm trying to figure out what all that's about. But rabbits, oh my gosh. So rabbits, it's really hard to like get them to sit still with people. And so as you were talking, I was thinking about trying to get a rabbit into a machine to do a functional MRI on them. And I feel like that's one of those things that if I'm having trouble remembering kind of what's going on or what's related to fear, I feel like that would be perfect because we know like everyone knows that, rabbits, bunnies, they get scared. And so one way to study them would be if we could look inside their brain. In that case, we can't, but at least people are more relaxed for the most part and can fit into an MRI machine. But it's just something that it sticks. And I know there's so much more that we want to talk about this.
Yeah, it's really interesting, like looking at different animals, the regions of the brain related to fear, like certain animals just have more of that than others. And so this might be something that kind of explains kind of like what's going on, like why a rabbit is generally more fearful than a turkey or some other creature out there. And you can kind of see how fear might be an important like evolutionary like characteristic, especially for prey, right? Because something that's more fearful and jittery and on the lookout all the time, like that thing is less likely to get sneaked up on by a predator than something that's just kind of, like relaxed and doesn't care and is not afraid. Something like if a squirrel just walked right up to a cat, right? Like you probably should have some fear, right? Like that's going to help you survive longer and pass down your genes. So there's definitely something to this, like from an evolutionary basis, which maybe explains why we as humans have fear, right? Like we should be afraid of lions because that's safe for us. We should be afraid of snakes because snakes can kill us, right? Like they have venom and things like that. And so there might be some like basis here that like fear was actually really important for us developmentally and like becoming humans and where we're at. And without that fear, we might not have survived.
Yeah. And I think this also comes back to like what we can learn from animals and rats. Rats are like, they exhibit the kind of fear response that allows us to study what kind of is going on with fear, how we respond to the environment when it comes to fear, as well as, what types of cues can induce fears or what areas, in the body physiologically correspond to different fear responses. And so a lot of what we learn, ends up being from animal studies, which is its own set of madness. But the fact that fear applies to basically every living, being, maybe not plants, but, yeah. But it allows us to learn so much more about what goes on. And that's why fear is also something that, compared to like disgust, there's a lot more information out there on fear, which is what allows us to have this like conversation during spooky season.
Yeah. I also just like while you're hitting disgust, like that's another example of one that like you don't see that as much in animals as you do in people. Like my dog does some things. I'm like, oh, that's gross. Right? Like, don't eat that, right? Like, don't eat that random thing you found on the sidewalk. And I'm disgusted by it, but he doesn't really care. And so that's kind of an interesting thing trying to understand that. Like disgust would be a harder thing for us to study versus fear. There's a lot of stuff I want to talk about with this. One of them is that fear is just a really strong motivator. Overall, there was a study that I think about actually fairly frequently in terms of like how fear motivates people. So I know there was there was an article in The Economist. I think it was a while ago. I think it was like over a decade ago, because it was when I was in med school is when I read this. I'm like, oh, this is super interesting. And this idea was like there was a factory where they were trying to motivate the workers to work hard. And so like they kind of were trying to figure out the best way to do this. And so they actually did an experiment like with these like two factories that were owned by the same company. And so one of the groups, they told the factory workers like, listen, if you work hard enough and you hit this quota and you get this much done, then we'll give you a bonus. Right. And then in the second factory, they say, hey, you guys all get a bonus. But if you perform below a certain level, then you don't get your bonus, right? That you're like that you earned like through the way that you work, you'll lose that. I mean, functionally, those two things are the exact same, right? You work above a certain level, you get a bonus. You work under that, you don't get a bonus. And the levels were the same. But what they found was the second group, the group that you told them like, hey, you got a bonus, but if you work under a level, you lose it. You lose that bonus. That group performed better. That group worked harder. They were more strongly motivated. So what this kind of tells us is that we have a fear of losing things, and that is a stronger motivator than trying to achieve something more. And that's a super interesting thing because functionally, like in terms of results and like overall, like those are the same scenario, but the way that you frame it to the person, like you're like, you can lose this or versus you can gain this, like that is, it's a little bit different. I know that kind of comes together a lot in a lot of different ways. But it also, there's some things kind of going on with like investing, right? Where people are like risk averse. Like a lot of people are afraid to like put their money in the stock market because what if it goes down and I'll lose all my money and like things like that. But I'm like, yeah, but like generally the stock market goes up. You put money in the stock market, you wait enough time, you will on average make more money. Like you will like, yeah, it might fluctuate a little bit, but that is a very strong bet to bet that the stock market will improve overall over time. I think if you look at like the last 50 years, if you look at like the top like main companies, generally they go up about 10% every year on average. Now, one year may go up 30%, one year may go down 5%, but like generally it goes up. But like because people have a fear of losing stuff, that pushes people away from that, and they tend to take their money and put it somewhere that's, yes, safe, but like you're not like, that's not like mathematically, it doesn't make sense. This is not a smart bet, right? Like a lot of people see that as like gambling, right? Going to like putting your money in the stock market. And in some ways it is, but imagine that a casino like was like the flip of a normal casino, that this casino, like if you just keep gambling long enough, you're going to win and you're going to make more money. And like, it's the odds are stacked in your favor. Like it makes sense. You should just go to that casino all the time and keep putting your money in. Yeah, you may have a bad day and it goes down a little bit, but on average it'll go up. But people are just so fearful that they tend to kind of avoid things like that. Which is interesting. There's a lot of other sociological stuff going in. I'm thinking about like, oh, there's so many other things to tie to this. But it's like a really interesting idea going through there.
Yeah, I feel like the banks, anyone who works at a bank that is listening to us is probably not thrilled with what we just said about their savings and checkings accounts. But yeah, and even, and I won't go into this because this is a rabbit hole. But this fear of losing things probably has a role in like relationships, honestly. But we're not going to go into that. But it might also play like it could just play a role on sometimes our inability to do things. Like, you know, you were talking about some, like just kind of how evolutionarily it's really important, you know, there's so much there.
The freezing and procrastination stuff, right? So it's like really interesting if you see a rabbit, right? And like you're on like the opposite, like you're a fair distance away, like the moment they see you, they're going to freeze. Right. And that's like something that's kind of like hardwired into them to kind of like freeze and not move. But, but if you start walking towards that rabbit, it's going to stay frozen until you get close enough, and then it's going to bolt. Right. And it's going to freak out. And like, you can also understand why this might be a good evolutionary idea, right? Like if you're a rabbit and there's a hawk around, you don't want them to see you. So the moment you see that hawk, you're going to freeze. Right. And so like, hopefully they don't see me. Hopefully they don't see me. And they get close enough. My terror builds enough to a threshold that I like take off and run and try to escape the predator. First, I'm trying to hide, and then I'm trying to escape. But it's really interesting trying to throw this with like procrastination, because this might be a little too on the nose for some of you guys listening. But I know for me, there's some stuff where I would like, I'm worried about this thing. I'm worried about this thing, but I'm actively not doing anything to like accomplish this and kind of conquer that thing.
Yeah. Don't worry, Mr. Hawkins.
No, there we go. I'm a predator. I'm not prey.
We don't freeze and run away when we see you.
Yeah.
So
I want to take a moment. I said I'm a predator. I really kind of like the moment I said that, I'm like, I don't like that I said that. Like let's retract that. I don't want to be labeled as a predator.
Oh Lord.
Okay.
Clearly this is one take.
Yes.
But so you're absolutely right. Like this idea of like we procrastinate, and it's like that freezing mechanism. But I think like the rabbits, and I like calling them bunnies. I know it's stupid, but it's just adorable. So like the bunnies, and if anyone knows the difference, let me know. But like these rabbits, these bunnies, like there comes a point where we kind of reach a threshold, and that fear overtakes that freeze response, and then that like flight comes into play. And I think that's kind of the same thing that happens with our procrastination, right? Like there is this kind of fear freeze response, and then the activation energy, right, is kind of high. But once that, like the night before, or some people the morning of, that fear of like, oh snap, it's here, the deadline is here, I can't like do anything else, I can't procrastinate. It's like we reach that fear threshold and like, oh, we can do that. And I think a lot of times that happens not just with homework assignments or papers, but also with exams. And I think that really underlies like a lot of students' needs and tendencies to cram for exams. And I think that is something that can bite us in the bum for the MCAT, right? This is an MCAT podcast at the end of the day. And this is not the kind of exam that you want to freeze for and procrastinate for and then try and,
like cram the week before. Right.
Yeah. No, that's not going to happen. No. Right. It's also like when you go to sit down and take a practice exam, it's really easy to be like, okay, I'm going to start it later. I don't have to start it at exactly 6 a.m. I'll just wait a little bit. 7 a.m. rolls around. It's like, I still have time. I still have 8 hours in the day to do it. And this is not something you want to do. You want to have that consistency when you're studying for the MCAT. So overcoming that natural fear response of freeze, then fly is helpful just for like how we think about how we're studying.
Yeah. So I know there's also like some other stuff kind of going on. I know it's kind of like political season as well. But I do want to take one moment to just talk about like this fear stuff is so ingrained in us. It's such an animalistic thing that is ingrained in animals kind of across the board. And that's why it's so powerful in us. And that makes it a good way to like persuade people to be active. It's something that like I was watching the Chiefs game the other day, go Chiefs. And like every ad was like a political ad. And it was just like, I got kind of like tired of it. I'd forgotten what it's like to watch real TV with ads. I'm like, oh man, like this is awful. But like an interesting thing is people very often are more motivated by fear. And so often political ads will focus on somebody's coming to get you. Someone's trying to take stuff from you. Like something bad is going to happen if the other side wins, or something bad is already happening. And like that sort of thing is very motivating to people, to like as a call to action to get them to go vote and go do things. And it turns out that can be more motivating than like, hey, let's make the world a better place. Let's go like do something good or things like that. And so that's why I feel like most political ads are focused on this, like bad stuff is going to happen if you don't vote or if you do this or do that. And it's kind of like a weird doom and gloomy sort of thing.
Yeah.
But it works because it's more motivating because it's tapping into fear. And it's something I kind of hate about us. Like, I wish it wasn't that way. I personally get really excited about trying to do and build like a better world and doing stuff and things like that. And like, I don't want to focus on everything that's bad in the world, but that can be really motivating. And it's not just politics, but also like news stuff, right? Like very often you'll see like an ad for like, tune in at 7 so that you can find out how your house is slowly killing you, or like things like that. And it's like, oh, that's motivating me to go watch the news is what they want. And so they want to use fear as a motivator. Yeah.
And education too, honestly. If anyone from school is watching this, don't hate me, but we just finished this course, and we talked about a lot of heavy topics and things like that. And among them, like there were things like climate change and how it affects how it affects the health of our patients, and like community violence and things like that. And a comment that one of my classmates made that I really appreciated was like, we're being told like all of these negative things, right? And like things that we are afraid will happen to our patients or, to society at large if we don't intervene, kind of like that political thing, but also just from a physician standpoint. And they said, they kind of tend to end these things with like, now you go and find the solution, right? And it's like, well, that's a little stressful. And, maybe also, and their point was, point out some of the positive things and the positive changes that are happening in this fear to go along with that. And I think that's such an important point because, like you said, like fear is such a big motivator that it's used even subconsciously in our education at times. And so kind of being mindful of that I hadn't thought about it until you talked about it. And I was like, there we go.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. Cause I remember like, as I was studying, feeling like, listen, if I don't learn this, like someone could die.
Yeah.
And like, that's a really powerful motivator, right? Like that fear, but like, just like the factory stuff, if it had been worded to me that like, listen, hey, learn this thing and you might be able to save someone's life, right? Like that's kind of the same thing, right? Like if you don't learn this, someone will die. And that's like a fear targeting thing versus saying like, oh, learn this and you'll be able to save someone's life. And like, that's kind of the same scenario. I will admit that the fear one motivates me more. And like, I really wish it didn't. Like, I wish that I didn't kind of live in this realm. And I think that it kind of creates this problem because fear is obviously stressful, right? And stress is like, it can motivate you to do things. But on the other hand, like long-term exposure to stress has a lot of like bad negative effects. And so like maybe if I really want to convince somebody of something, maybe fear is actually a good strategy to get them to do that thing. But if everyone is doing this all the time because we all are trying to convince the same person to buy my product, vote for my person, tune into the news, study for the test, right? If everything is fear, then you kind of have this overwhelming stress like response, and that can like cause cortisol release, which makes you be tired more often, makes you hungry, makes you overeat, makes your blood sugar go up, makes you get sick more often. And it has a lot of like actual like physiologic effects from that stress. And so it's just kind of an interesting thing trying to understand how this all fits together. Fear can be a good motivator. It is a good motivator. Is it healthy if that's the only way you're motivated by everything all the time? Probably not. but it's just kind of a weird thing to think about.
Yeah. And I think the thing that makes it tough is it's neurologically wired, right?
Mm-hmm. And so I think maybe just understanding it about yourself is a good way to tackle this. I do want to mention the actual neurological structures, right? Like what's going on with the amygdala. Like the amygdala is the main region of the brain associated with fear. And obviously this is tied a lot to the limbic system and like the hippocampus. And so there's a lot of like memories can like be tied to fear. Like you had a bad experience with a dog as a kid, you will probably be afraid of dogs as you get older. But like we can kind of like go and measure the region of the brain that is, we can measure the amygdala and we can measure the activity of the amygdala. And we can see that like, oh, when exposed to fear, that's what's going on. But there's also something kind of interesting, like with like, so my dog does not have a fear response. Like he is like generally his amygdala is probably tiny because anytime he sees a person, he's like, yay, person, and like runs up and wants to like play with the mailman and play with everyone all the time, which is awesome and fun, rather than a dog that's like afraid of everything and barking and scared and like that sort of stuff. There are times I wish my dog would like, listen, don't just run up to strangers and run into the lake, especially because he's a Great Dane. And when he runs up to other dogs or other people, very often they get afraid because they're like, oh my gosh, there's a horse with teeth running at me. And so he induces fear in other people rather than in himself. Aww. But you could see how, like, even within like natural variation within people, there are certain people which are more fearful than others. And like it might actually just be a physiologic, like neurologic, structural thing. Like some people have a bigger hippocampus than others, or not hippocampus, amygdala. And I generally am one of those people. I am not risk averse, right? I will take risks and I will do stuff, and I do stuff that is probably dangerous. And and I had no fear as a child. But it's just kind of interesting, kind of like trying to understand this. I have a friend who has 2 daughters, and one of the daughters is afraid of everything. And one of the daughters is like the opposite, like not afraid of anything. And it's just like they were raised in like the same environment, but there's like neurological differences here, kind of going into that. And so like my friend is trying to convince one of their kids to like, okay, strangers are not all bad, right? We don't need to be afraid and hide from strangers when we're in Walmart. Like the kid's trying to like hide behind, like wants to be in the cart and wants to be covered up with a blanket because they don't want like anyone to find them. And then the other kid's like running up to strangers. And so one of the kids, they're like, okay, listen, other people are fine. Except for you need to be afraid of people, and like trying to give them opposite messages at the same time.
And I think what you said about like, as kids, sometimes, some of us are less afraid and then like get a little bit more cautious as we get older. And I wonder how much of that is just like wiring, right? Because I was also, as a kid, put me on the roller coaster, drop me, those ones that they like take you up and then they drop you down. I loved those. I jumped off of like this waterfall cliff, burst my eardrum, and was like ready the next day. Whereas I don't know that I would do that right now.
I wish my sister was on this episode, because she talks about this all the time. About like what a weenie I've become. But like growing up, like I was not afraid of anything. Like I would like, what would be fun? To jump off the barn onto the trampoline. And so it's like 3 stories up. I'm like, I'm going to drag the trampoline over here, jump off the barn to land on the trampoline. And now like I'll go hiking with my sister in the mountains and I'm like, I'm freaking out, right? Like I'm way too high and this is like messing with me. And I'm like really one of those was way more dangerous than the other. But like now all of a sudden I'm afraid of heights versus before I had no fear of them. I was jumping off bridges and into rivers and off the barn. And
this reminds me of so many stories. Like you said, jumping off the barn, I like jumped off the roof into the pool. I was like, should not have been doing this.
No,
I've wanted to go skydiving since I was a little girl. And the longer time passes, the more I'm like, what if I like get up there and don't jump out? Like, I don't want to be that person that comes back down. But, there's so many, the thing is, it's not just the amygdala that is wired into this whole thing, right? Because we said that some people, they like scary movies, they like, you know, haunted houses and being absolutely terrified. And what I found out very recently was that there's a part of the midbrain that is also tied in with fear. I will say a name. You do not need to know it for the MCAT, but I think it just helps me because I'm going to use an acronym later. So the ventral tegmental area. So you're just going to hear me refer to it as the VTA, not on the MCAT. So this VTA area in the midbrain is tied in with the reward pathway. It's tied in with psych disorders. It also modulates fear and anxiety, and it connects to the amygdala. So it makes sense why it would be involved in these things. And I think what's really cool is that 65% of this, you know, VTA is actually dopamine mediated. And so it's really cool because then you're thinking, okay, this same area that is responsible and at least contributes to fear and anxiety also contributes to the reward pathway. So is it possible that in some people, since it's releasing that dopamine, it's like reinforcing, oh, like a little bit of scary is fine, right? Not the kind that throws you into that threshold and like, oh snap, now you're running from a bear. But like, you know, some people are definitely your friend's daughter. Maybe there's some wiring up in the VTA right now.
Yeah, but maybe she is afraid of kids, but she's just excited or afraid of strangers, but just she's a thrill seeker. Yeah, funny.
And so who knows? Maybe thrill seekers, they have, you know, this stronger tie with the reward pathway.
Yeah, that also goes into kind of like neuroplasticity, right? Yeah. And understanding that brain structures can change. And maybe that's why I've kind of molded and become more fearful over time. I honestly think, like, I definitely wasn't planning on going to this, but like, there are some things that happened in my life in like early 20s where just kind of like bad stuff happened overall. Like my family's house burned down and like a bunch of other things kind of going on. And like before that, I was kind of like, I wasn't afraid of anything. And after that is maybe when I like, okay, now I'm afraid of heights and afraid of things. And like, it might be something like a rewiring of my brain versus before nothing bad could ever happen. And so I wasn't afraid of anything. And then after that, bad stuff happens. And so my brain rewired like, okay, like fear, like there's some bad stuff in the world that can happen. And so we should be afraid and, you know, make sure to like do what we can to avoid those things, because fear can be a good motivator, as we've, you know, I feel like hammered into the dirt.
Yeah. And I think this also goes back to, because maybe you're listening to us and you're just like, wait, so am I kind of stuck being like more afraid the older I get and then just anxious, and I'm stuck anxious and like with all these phobias now because I'm terrified of things. But I think that idea of neuroplasticity is so important for why things like therapy work, right? Forcing yourself to come up with new things that you're saying, or, you know, pushing yourself, talking through and then reinforcing, right, these new ideas or new experiences, which is why it can be helpful for some fear related situations and conditions. And so I think it's also helpful to keep that in mind. Like fear is not, it's useful for motivation. It can cause a ridiculous amount of distress. It can change how we perceive the world, but it doesn't have to be the end all kind of be all.
Yeah. And I feel like, you know, for the listeners out there who are studying for the MCAT, at least for me, I thrived on that. Like fear is motivating me to get my homework done because I procrastinated stuff. And so when I got to med school and dealing with the MCAT, like that doesn't work as well because it's too long. It's too big of a thing, right? I think fear can be a good motivator for a short-term thing, right? But if you're trying to like live in fear so that you're motivated to study for the next 6 months, right? Like that is not healthy. And that is not something to be able to keep up. So I'm trying to kind of figure out kind of like how fear is influencing you. Because I know a lot of students are studying because they're afraid of doing bad on the MCAT, right? They're afraid of not getting into medical school. And that can be a good motivator short term, but it is not a good long-term healthy way of approaching things. And so it's just kind of an interesting way to kind of like come at this, and an interesting way to kind of think about this. I feel like it's weird because I knew what we were going to talk about today, but us talking through it, Azaii, has made me realize things about myself, like multiple things. So I don't know if anyone else listening is like having these kind of like these like light bulb moments. I know you did, as I talking about like your class that you're in. I hope you guys are coming to as many conclusions as we are, just kind of like trying to understand how this all kind of fits together.
If you're listening on a platform that lets you leave comments, let us know. Are you a thrill seeker or thrill averse?
Yes. I do also want to add in, that's a good segue. So as of this week, we now have an email. It is podcast@jackwestin.com. So if you guys have questions or comments, you can definitely leave them in like the comments of whatever platform you're listening to this, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, whatever. Leave reviews. That actually helps us a ton to like get more people involved in this and get more suggested to other people. But if you have something that you want to talk about that is a little bit more like maybe private or a more specific question, please reach out to us. We'd love to do an episode in the future where we're just kind of like going through students' questions and answering questions you guys have. So I just want to like reiterate one more time. The email is podcast@jackwestin.com. And so I'm actually really looking forward to that. We just created this. And I'm like, now I want to be conversing rather than me just talking out into the ether. I want to get some feedback back from students and questions and comments so that we can better serve you, because that's why we do this, is because we want to help you guys make it through this process, beat the MCAT, get into medical school. Don't live in fear the whole time. But just kind of like make it through this process.